Please like and leave a comment, and share this video.
Welcome to live show 98, an emergency live show, quite the ending, World War III starting. Coming to you from a wet and chilly Minsk, Belarus. This is an emergency live show we've not scheduled to have, as we're packing up the studio to move to a new location. But with the news in the past 2 days of Ukraine/NATO strikes on Russia, we deemed it important to have this show tonight. It's Wednesday, November the 21st, 2024, and we're streaming live on Rumble and YouTube. Tonight's show is packed as I discuss missile strikes and Russia and the conflict with Michael from Bukhanka Watch. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, share this video as it really helps us grow and reach more viewers. Now let's get on with the show.
Could be wrong. I could be right.
Good evening, everyone. Today we delve into the topic that's not just complex but pivotal to understanding of the geopolitical chessboard we're currently witnessing. As we speak, the situation between Russia and NATO involving Ukraine as the epicenter has escalated to a point where the term World War III isn't sensationalism, it's chillingly possible. So let's get into this, the provocation. Critics argue that this isn't just a natural progression of conflict, but a calculated escalation by the West, particularly what some call the deep state. NATO's expansion eastward, despite assurances, has been seen by Russia as a direct threat. And now, with Biden administration's green light for Ukraine to strike Russia with US-made ATACMS missiles, we see a move that could interpret as direct participation in the conflict. So, what's Russia's response? In response, President Putin has updated Russia's nuclear doctrine, signaling that any significant conventional attack could invite a nuclear response. This isn't just posturing, it's a statement of readiness for a confrontation that could provoke a nuclear power war. So what is the counter-narrative? Support for Ukraine. However, others argue that it is about countering Russian aggression, the annexation of Crimea, the actions in Donetsk and Lugansk, and the broader incursions into Ukraine are seen as provocations by Russia itself. From this perspective, NATO's actions are defensive, aimed at protecting Ukraine's sovereignty and upholding international law. The question still arises, when is NATO's support really about provocation, or is it about maintaining a balance against the revisionist power? What are the current developments? Missile strikes. The recent drone attack in the Kursk region by Ukraine, followed by the use of Storm Shadow missiles, which we'll see right now, marks a significant escalation. This isn't just about testing boundaries, it's about altering the conflict's essence. And these are taken from a Ukrainian UAV recording the Storm Shadow strikes. And these are sections of the Storm Shadow bits that were found after the strike. So the global reactions, countries like Germany and Italy have refused to allow their weapons to be used in a manner highlighting a divide within NATO. And the voices of concern are nuclear rhetoric. Russian state TV has been preparing its citizens for potential nuclear scenarios. Let's watch this video.
Чем ответит Россия? Ответ может быть любым. Любым. Не зря скорректирована наша ядерная доктрина. Как не раз подчеркивал президент Путин, ракетные удары вглубь территории России изменят природу конфликта, саму его суть, станут радикальной эскалацией. Ведь США, Англия и Франция прямо вступают в войну с Россией со всеми вытекающими последствиями для их собственных территорий и тех, кто эти территории населяет. Ну а жителям Украины, что живут по соседству с аэродромами, где базируется F-16, лучше переехать от них подальше.
while Western leaders like the French Foreign Minister downplay these threats as rhetoric. This guy here. And what's the public sentiment? The global public, meanwhile, watches with a mixed fascination and fear, with memes and public discussions reflecting both the gravity and the absurdity of the situation. I laughed at this meme. Watch this. Look at this. This is funny. When you're laughing at World War III memes and suddenly the sun comes out at 3 a.m. So as a conclusion, as we stand here today, the world is on the tender hooks. The decisions made by leaders in Washington, Brussels, Moscow and Kiev will not just shape their nations, but will determine the peace or peril of global civilization. We're not just talking about regional conflicts anymore, we're discussing potential for a nuclear confrontation. And it's imperative for all stakeholders to reassess their positions, push for diplomacy and over-escalation, and consider the catastrophic costs of continuing down this path. The only way forward is through dialogue, understanding and an urgent ceasefire. So is the latest actions by the US and UK with missile strikes into Russia signalling the start of World War III? I think it does. This isn't just about supporting Ukraine anymore, it's about direct military engagement in a manner that could be very well interpreted as an act of war by Russia. When you have nations like the US and the UK allowing and indeed facilitating strikes deep into Russian territory, you're looking at significant escalation. The implications are enormous. Russia has already responded with words, updating its nuclear doctrine to reflect the readiness to respond to such provocations. And while many might dismiss nuclear threats as mere posturing, the historical context of these words cannot be ignored. We've seen in the past how quickly cold rhetoric can lead to hot conflict. This scenario isn't just a regional conflict anymore, it's a global one, involving nuclear powers and their alliances, where each move could lead us closer to a catastrophic escalation. It's reminiscent of chess games during the Cold War, but with much more at stake now. So yes, I believe these actions are a signal, not just a conflict expansion, but of a potential slide into a broader, more devastating war. The world needs to watch closely, and more importantly, the leaders involved must reassess their strategies. The dialogue should not be about who can deliver the next strike, but how we can pull back from the brink. And my final thought, the stakes are too high for brinkmanship. It's not just about who prevails on the battlefield, but what about ensuring humanity doesn't become the ultimate casualty of political gamemanship. And I could be wrong, and I could be right.
Could be wrong. I could be right.
Hello everybody, we've got Michael from Bukhanka Watch on through Telegram. And hi Michael, how are you?
Yeah, I'm okay. How are you?
I'm
You
good,
doing
thanks.
well?
Yep. And can you tell everybody where they can get hold of you if they want?
Yeah, so if you just look up Bukhanka Watch on Telegram, you'll find the Telegram page where I sort of meander my way through the Slavic world and keeping eyes on what's happening between Russia and Ukraine. And if you just look up Michael Delabrock on Twitter, it should bring up my Twitter account. They're kind of the two places where I'm mostly active.
So, Michael, Biden's decision, with Biden's administration now allowing Ukraine to use American long-range missiles and obviously UK missiles against Russian territory, how do you see this altering the dynamics of the conflict?
And there's two different ways to view this in my estimation. One's the purely tactical, what effect this will have on the direct kinetic element of the conflict, the fighting, how it will potentially impact the capabilities of the Russians, what the Russian escalation or retaliation towards this might be, which we have just seen is actually in the form of firing ICBMs at Dnipro. And then there's the wider sort of geopolitical, diplomatic aspect of the ratcheting up of the tension of this event. So just to sort of quickly summarize it from my estimation, as I say at the moment, I think this opens up a number of ways for the Ukrainians to inflict a bit more hurt on the Russians. It opens up new strike capabilities for the Ukrainians to hit things like command and control centers. Depending on what the actual limitations, if there are any, on the Ukrainian use of these weapons, potentially the Ukrainians are now able to hit certain Russian air bases, which would therefore impact the ability of Russian tactical aviation to make an effect on the battlefield. Certain logistics points behind the lines, high value targets of opportunity, troop concentrations, high ranking generals, that sort of thing. Because of the nature of ATACMS and to a degree Scalp, although a Scalp is Storm Shadow, Scalp/Storm Shadow, it's the same system, is slower because it's a cruise missile, whereas the ATACMS is a ballistic missile. ATACMS is the quicker one, so there's a faster turnaround for the Ukrainians to potentially identify a high value target and put an ATACMS onto it. Scalp has the ability to weave its way through Russian air defense systems, which it seems to have done in recent days. The way I see it is it's certainly an upgrading of the Ukrainian capability in terms of inflicting damage on the Russians, but in terms of actually changing the direction of the conflict and specifically the fighting around Kursk Oblast, which is where these weapon systems have now been allowed to be deployed. I don't think it's really going to change the general direction and course of the fighting in the area. ATACMS and Scalp have been okayed for use in quote-unquote internationally recognized Ukraine for pretty much more than around about a year now. And while they've certainly inflicted certain very damaging and hurtful blows against the Russians, bridges in Zaporizhia, arms depot in the Donbass, for example, they haven't ultimately changed the basic equation on the ground, is where the Russians are effectively on the offensive. They have a definitive advantage and they are gaining ground. So I think this is more just more for the publicity of the event and to inflict a bit more damage on Russia and the Russians. But in terms of actually changing the direction of the conflict, I'm very skeptical of it because it hasn't been able to achieve that else on other fronts during this war. The other aspect is the wider geopolitical and diplomatic aspect of this. One of the major justifications that Moscow came out with for its military invasion of Ukraine, intervention, however you want to term it, was specifically naming the ATACMS systems and systems like it that might have hypothetically been deployed within a NATO membership Ukrainian state in the future that could then have been deployed against Russia proper. Of course, that issue is now moot because this is kind of happening de facto at this stage. But nonetheless, it does kind of ring a very strong alarm bell that this is one of the big reasons that the Russians justified specifically naming this specific system as one of the things that they feared, and now it is effectively being used in the way that they had feared it to have been used. So one aspect of this is I think this is the Biden administration just running out the clock, trying to make things potentially difficult for Donald Trump's incoming administration. Of course, Biden no longer has a mandate. He's in his lame duck era of his presidency, so effectively there is no ramifications for him personally and potentially for his administration and the Democrats as a party politically to just effectively take the mask off and go all in on Ukraine. This is kind of what we were expecting had Kamala Harris had won the election, but now I guess since they're leaving office and Trump's coming in the office is just try and create a big mess for him politically, destabilize the conflict, heighten it up to make his hypothetical peace overtures more difficult in a more unstable and high intensity conflict whenever he enters office. In terms of Russia, I think this is a bit of a humiliation for Russia, as I was kind of outlining. They specifically warned against these systems being used against Russia proper, Whenever I use that term, I mean what is quote unquote internationally recognized Russia, as in the borders pre 2014. Now these weapons have been used inside Russia. So now the question is what is the Russian escalation and retaliation to this event? While we've just kind of seen it in the form that they are now deploying intercontinental ballistic missiles against targets in Ukraine, this is the first time in human history that such a weapon system has been used aggressively in warfare. Any other time these weapon systems have been launched, it's usually is tests. They've never actually been fired at a target, at a hostile enemy target that has the potential to kill people. So that's one element of the Russian escalation, and to me that's sending a very big red flag from Moscow, saying that you keep saying we're bluffing about our nuclear potential. Well, this specific ICBM, we don't know the exact model that was used yet, but it appears there was potentially 4 missiles were fired at Dnipro. But these are the kind of missiles, these missiles are specifically designed in the Soviet era and newer versions in the Russian Federation to put nuclear warheads on the top of, to fire at cities like Washington, London, New York, Los Angeles. It includes in the name intercontinental ballistic missile. You don't generally use these to just fire a high explosive warhead halfway around the world. You fire this to kill millions of people halfway around the world in your to inflict strategic damage on what you would perceive to be your hostile enemy power. So the fact that the Russians are now firing these with high explosive warheads, so thank God they haven't fired a nuclear weapon into Ukraine, and I don't expect they ever would. But to me, this is a statement of intent by Moscow saying, don't forget we have this stuff. And it's very simple and very easy for us to swap out the conventional warheads for the nuclear warheads. So if you really want to play the escalatory game, we can do that. And it could result in hundreds of millions of deaths and potentially the end of human civilization. So to me, I think the Russians to a degree are kind of in a bind as to how they can properly retaliate or escalate towards Western it's going to sound a bit strange, but this escalatory cycle where the West, it's been happening for years. Moscow's laid down many red lines against such systems going to Ukraine, and effectively the Ukrainians in the West have crossed every single one of them. And the Russian retaliation to that is usually a larger than normal air raid against targets in Ukraine. Because obviously the Russians can't exactly start firing missiles at the United Kingdom or Germany or the United States, because that would precipitate a general conflict. So they've kind of had their hands tied behind their back to a degree into how they could properly respond to this. This to me is kind of a bit of an innovative way and a very eye-catching way for the Russians to actually properly send a signal and retaliate to this escalation from the United States and Ukraine. Like I say, the only step up you could really get from this would be an ICBM landing in a Ukrainian city with a nuclear warhead, which would never happen. I don't think Moscow is ever going to do that. I don't think the situation would ever come about where they would do that, but it is, in terms of what the Russians could do, short of nuking a city in Ukraine or in the West, or starting a general conflict with NATO, which would ultimately end in nuclear conflagration. This is just below that kind of level. So I think this is going to be talked about in some very high-level military and diplomatic circles in the days to come. I do find it very interesting that the Western intelligence and the Ukrainians were aware that the Russians were preparing to fire these missiles. Though it appears that they expected it to be fired at Kiev as opposed to the city of Dnipro. So it just complete speculation, and how exactly they got that intelligence does kind of tell me that it's kind of been evident throughout the war that Western/Ukrainian have fairly decent infiltration of Russian military networks. But obviously it's not perfect in that they got the city wrong and the timing wrong, because the original hypothesis put out by, for example, the American embassy and by Ukrainian intelligence was that Kiev was to be hit on the 20th or the 19th by this missile, whereas it turned out to be Dnipro on the 21st. So that's just a little caveat and something of interest that I've picked up in of this latest event. So.
Now, that'll bring me on to my next question. Nuclear rhetoric versus reality. Russia has updated its nuclear doctrine. How seriously should the international community take these threats, especially in the light of Putin's statements?
Well, they should and they shouldn't, which is kind of a self-defeating statement in of itself. But anytime someone changes their nuclear doctrine, because of the nature of the weapon system themselves and the ramifications and connotations of their use, I do think it's important that international players do pay very close attention to what exactly is said and how they go about stepping around such statements and doctrines, especially whenever there is an active, high-intensity conflict ongoing with a power involved that has nuclear weapons. But at the same time, it's kind of, the way I view it is, it's kind of like a lion in a cage, as it were. Say you go to the zoo and there's a lion and you're seeing a lion in its exhibit. You do respect the lion because there is this innate danger of the lion, and if the lion should ever escape from its paddock, it is an extremely dangerous animal. But while it's in its paddock, it is relatively safe. So I don't know if that analogy quite works out in the way that it appears in my head. I don't expect that Putin is actually anticipating ever deploying nuclear weapons. I do think there is an element of bluff, but also a bit of strategic posturing and game playing here by Moscow, buoyed up by the fact that they deployed these ICBMs. Another aspect of this, which I think is probably the real angle that's coming here, is I think the view in Moscow at the moment, going back to my previous answer, is they've dealt with ATACMS and they've dealt with Storm Shadow for pretty much over a year now. And it is not this war-defining, war-changing weapon that it is. So the fact it's going to be used inside Russia as well could be painful, but ultimately the Russians will adapt and overcome it and mitigate it. So I don't... Rhetoric's one thing, but I think the view in Moscow is that the Biden administration is kind of going gloves off because it's winding down the clock. So, and there's feelers obviously being put out in sort of this coy game being played between Moscow, Kiev, and the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration about pardon me, the incoming Trump administration about its policies and visions for what a settlement in Ukraine would be. So one aspect to think of this is giving these weapons the okay to be used by Ukraine inside internationally recognized Russia is the perception to build up that Ukraine is strong, is that it's bolstering Ukraine's potential position in a future negotiation, ceasefire or peace talks. So the way the Russians kind of slap that down is, well, we have a bigger weapon system, so we're going to use it. We're going to show that we're willing to use it. We have used it in the form of this ICBM strike. So I think that's the kind of aspect in the way this is to be viewed as, is that I do find it interesting that the doctrine changed after the presidential election. So the way I sort of view this is, it is a bluff and it kind of isn't a bluff. Not that he would ever actually use nuclear weapons, but in the sense that it is bolstering Russia's rhetoric and position going into the hypothetical peace talks that might begin this year under the Trump administration. So if the Russians started the conflict and said, we're not going to use any nuclear weapons, just completely, there will be no circumstances at all where we would ever use a nuclear weapon at all in any scenario, well, then going into some kind of negotiations or talks, well, then you're the people that they are, the powers that they will be negotiating with, can just discount that sort of card that the Russians could play in any hypothetical negotiations in conferences that might come down the road. Whereas if the Russians are stopping, but firing the weapon systems that the nuclear weapons would be hypothetically attached to, and then changing your doctrine in which you would use those nuclear weapons, would sort of bolster that position and that perception that, well, we can't just take that card off the table while we're talking with the Russians, because the Russians are pretty strongly insinuating that card is in play. So that's kind of how I'm viewing that. That's kind of how I'm viewing the change in doctrine and Russian statements at the moment. They'll never use them, or if they do, we're all kind of dead, so it's kind of irrelevant. But at the same time, they are playing up the fact that they have changed the doctrine and they do have these weapons. So whenever they go into discussions with Kiev and with Washington, that is a pretty big, bright, shiny card that they can play on the table. I'd say, look, we have used this weapon system. We do have the capability to strap these weapons to this weapon system. So it's time to dial down the tension in the conflict and let's start to figure out a equitable, maybe not an equitable, but let's try and work out a settlement to this conflict before something goes very wrong and someone oversteps the mark and we feel forced into deploying our nuclear arsenal.
So NATO's role in expansion. Some view NATO's eastward expansion as a provocation to Russia. Do you believe this perspective has merit, or is NATO merely acting in self-defense?
I think it undoubtedly is provocative to Russia. It evidently is so. The 2008 Georgian War, although the fact the starting of that conflict itself was more on the Georgian side than the Russians, but the Bucharest summit in 2008, a lot the same year as the Georgian War, the events in Ukraine itself, the rhetoric from the Yeltsin administration and then the Putin administration towards NATO expansion, it undoubtedly is provocative to Moscow, and understandably so. Russia is the main successor state of the USSR, inherited that sort of idea and the position that, well, what was the original formation of NATO was very explicitly against the USSR as a defensive alliance, quote unquote, against the USSR. So whenever the USSR collapsed, why wasn't NATO disbanded or a new piece of framework brought into Europe, or why wasn't Russia extended an olive branch and invited in to become a member of NATO? These various questions have been played out over the decades, and evidently the answer is that because NATO views Russia as the successor of the USSR in the sense that it is an antagonistic power of which NATO is arrayed against and is effectively in opposition to. So I completely understand, and I think there is a very strong, legitimate argument for Moscow and for the Russians to view the eastward expansion of NATO as a provocative and expansionary and dangerous development towards Russia. In terms of, now that's the perception. In terms of the actual reality of it, I think it would be a bit different. In the sense that, do I ever really think there is a idea that NATO would aggressively, unprovoked attack Russia? I don't think that's particularly on the cards as well, because I don't see what benefit that would have out of NATO attacking, and also getting the agreement of all NATO powers to agree to such a measure as well. I don't think you would ever get the Hungarians, the Spanish, the Italians, the Slovaks, depending on what government was in power at the time, the Bulgarians. I don't think you could ever get a unanimous agreement.
Okay, so we've seen a split in European response to this escalation, with countries like Germany and Italy refusing to allow their weapons to be used in this manner. What does this division tell us about the cohesion of NATO?
It's a bit of a complex question, because ultimately, although a lot of events towards Ukraine is couched in the rhetoric of NATO, I don't think it ultimately should be, because not all the members of NATO are actually in agreement towards this sort of what is commonly said to be the NATO policy towards Ukraine. Often it is coalitions of NATO powers coming together to agree a policy towards Ukraine and Russia. But as I was just kind of elucidating in the previous answer, the Hungarians are clearly not on board with the idea that NATO is effectively at loggerheads with Russia. The Slovaks, since their government have changed, are very much of that view. While there is certainly a very strong majority of NATO powers that have gone along with the common idea that Ukraine is an ally, should be a member of NATO, and we need to support them against the Russians. There are notable exceptions that have been against that. However, in terms of specifically singling out Germany, Germany is an interesting case because of the particular history that it has with Russia, going back to World War II and even after World War II and the collapse of the GDR and Unified Republic. You had very close relations with, for example, Gerhard Schroeder, and this sort of legacy, Russophilia, particularly in Eastern Germany, or what used to be Eastern Germany. And that sort of seems, plus also the pacifist legacy that is very ingrained in German politics. However, the problem is that's a policy of the current SDP Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who at the moment is about to be ousted from power, and it appears very much that a CDU-led government is about to come into power, and the lead candidate for the chancellorship under the CDU is very much a hawk towards Russia. So the specific example here is the British, the French have sent Storm Shadow to Ukraine. Why wouldn't the Germans send their equivalent called Taurus? It does appear that after the election in Germany, that depending on what the situation is with Trump and the conflict in Ukraine at the time, is that the Germans will fall into line and eventually send Taurus themselves under the new government. In terms of wider cohesion, I think in many respects NATO is actually stronger because of what's happened in Ukraine. I think in many regards, some of the highest officials in NATO are probably thanking Vladimir Putin for his intervention in Ukraine, because while there might be individual disagreements amongst member states, there is no serious talk amongst any of them about withdrawal from NATO. The Hungarians, there's no serious discussion in Budapest about withdrawal from NATO. There's no serious discussion in Bratislava. If anything, any discussion about the downsizing of NATO is actually tends to be like left-wing, really pro-Ukrainian liberals talking about kicking out the Turks or kicking out the Hungarians, as opposed to these countries leaving of their own volition. It tends to be along political lines that, oh, well, they're not anti-Russian enough for us, or they have the wrong political policies towards domestic politics than we would like, so therefore they should be kicked out of NATO. That's the only real discussion, and even then that's a very marginal position that you see on Twitter/X. If anything, the trend that I've seen is a strengthening of NATO outside of various select members. As there seems to be a strong strengthening common policy amongst NATO members and expansion of the alliance. For obviously the biggest example here being Sweden and Finland, two formerly very neutral powers that might not, well, Finland especially might have had an interesting relation with Russia and the USSR, but nonetheless these two powers are now NATO members, particularly the Swedes. It should be said that Sweden, like Switzerland, has a very strongly rooted had a very strongly rooted historical policy of neutrality that has been swept away. Sweden wasn't involved in, for example, World War One, World War Two, conflicts throughout the Cold War. I think for most of the 18th century, going back to the Napoleonic era as well, is that Sweden adhered to this very strong policy of neutrality. But yeah, Vladimir Putin's intervention in Ukraine has pushed the Swedish government, Sweden as a nation, to ascend to NATO. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I think by and large the events in Ukraine have actually strengthened NATO a great deal in terms of the political unanimity amongst the member states and a sort of common policy amongst them all, while there's disagreements amongst many member states about what weapon systems to send and certain capabilities to give to Ukraine. Generally, you'll find, again, with very select exceptions, pretty much every NATO state has sent weaponry in some form to Ukraine. So it's not a disagreement of should we support Ukraine. It's more a disagreement of how much to support Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Given Trump's previous stance on NATO and Ukraine, how do you think this decision by the Biden administration might affect his foreign policy upon taking office?
I think it's potentially, in a certain way, it could complicate it, but it could also smooth his overtures and the process to begin negotiations. The problem is that it seems that Biden could potentially, over the coming weeks, just really go hands off and just start sending anything and everything to Ukraine to strengthen the Ukrainian position as much as possible, to sort of give succor to Kiev, to the idea that maybe here's enough weapons, here's enough support while I'm still in office for you guys to maybe try and think that you could go it alone, or, well, maybe not go it alone, but to try and give the Ukrainians maybe ideas a bit ahead of themselves about capabilities, what they are capable of as opposed to what they actually are. Because it does seem to be that there is a growing feeling amongst Ukrainian commentators that, and certain European states, that they might have to quote unquote go it alone without the Americans under Trump. How feasible that would be is another question. I'd say it's very unlikely. So if Biden just starts shipping everything and anything to Ukraine while he still can, there's talk about him pretty much canceling a significant amount of Ukrainian sovereign debt towards the United States. These kind of things. To me, that sort of, because it does seem to be that Trump's policy, although we've gotten hints of it, but we haven't gotten any firm policy statements, seems to be that the big blockage for Trump is more Kiev than it is Moscow. I think this is because Trump probably had a very good working relationship with Putin from his first term, and I think he has this idea that he could just kind of slot back into that and restart that working relationship with Russia. Mm-hmm. Whereas a lot of Western rhetoric from the United States and Western powers over the past couple years of the conflict has been everything, we'll give stuff to Ukraine, but ultimately Ukraine's the people who drive the car as such. How real that was in reality is another question, but the rhetoric has always been that everything is done with the consent of the Ukrainians. It's the Ukrainians who set the policy. We just provide the arms, the monetary resources to do it. Whereas Trump seems to be, again, just from the sort of vague statements that we've gotten from his campaign and from his would-be administration, it seems to be that his idea is either we need to rein in Kiev. Kiev needs to understand that it has to make concessions. There will be no return to quote-unquote 1991 borders, which is something that's very strong in the Ukrainian government. Anytime they talk about some kind of settlement, it always comes back to 1991 borders. That seems to be the very big sticking point at the moment, whereas Trump seems to be very much of the idea that that's not feasible, that the Ukrainians have to give ground on that, both literally and metaphorically. So if Biden can sort of build up the Ukrainian military to get into their head that they might be able to fight it out a bit longer, even in the face of potential winding down of support from a Trump administration, that might complicate things and make negotiations a bit harder from Washington, from Donald Trump's Washington's point of view. But at the same time, with the escalation of tensions, with Russia now firing ICBMs at Ukraine, with the Ukrainians now firing ATACMS potentially into Kursk, Bryansk, Voronezh oblasts, the scenario I can see is, say if a Russian ICBM has the wrong target or it hits a school, an apartment complex. These aren't drones. These aren't the scale of missiles that have been fired. If one of these hits an apartment complex, it's going to wipe out the apartment complex, even with a conventional warhead, just from the kinetic power alone. You're talking potentially hundreds dead. If a Ukrainian ATACMS does the same thing, although the explosive power is significantly smaller, it is going to be devastating. Say if it hits an apartment complex, God forbid, a school, a hospital. These are the weapons systems and the potentialities that could cause significant and very high-profile incidents and losses of life, which could feed into the perception that the war is starting to really spiral out of control. And then maybe there might be a bit of domestic or international pressure on either side to start to rein in ambitions and start to actually sit down and talk about this conflict, about some kind of settlement to bring the shooting war to an end in some form, or at least dial it back significantly.
Mm-hmm. How should the public interpret the varied reactions from government figures like Donald Trump regarding this escalation?
Well, without if to my knowledge, Donald Trump himself hasn't exactly commented it himself, but certainly people around the Trump administration,
and also like the French foreign minister who said, there should be more strikes into Russia.
Yeah, well, in terms of actual sitting governments, the big examples to me are the United States and Britain, for what is essentially a massive escalation. Again, I hate to labor the point, but it's gotten to the stage where the Russians are firing ICBMs at cities, something that has never happened before in human history. The escalation is massive on both sides here. And I just find it astonishing that the British government hasn't made a single statement about this publicly, apart from a couple of brief statements in a Ministry of Defense communique. They haven't gone to Parliament. They haven't addressed the House. They haven't addressed the nation. Keir Starmer is off swanning about at the G20 summit in Rio, despite the fact that his government has essentially potentially set us on course for direct kinetic conflict with Russia. It's astounding to me that such a decision of the gravity of it has just been made with such a lack of consideration or discussion with not just the British people, but with Parliament in general. Obviously, he is a massive majority in Parliament, but nonetheless, it just astounds me that this government is effectively, it feels like we're kind of in July and August 1914, where there is just this insane drive to war. And unlike 1914, where there was constant sittings of Parliament in the July crisis before the declaration of war in Germany, there is no sitting in Parliament or discussion about this in Parliament, or even really with the media. Is this Labour government, Keir Starmer's government, is just kind of, like it's done through its very short tenure in power, is just sort of lackadaisically meandering its way through a massive international crisis and domestic crises, and just seems to be carrying on with no discussion, no admission, no recognition of the gravity of its actions at all. Same as with the United States. Obviously, the United States is kind of caught up in the incoming Trump administration, but to my knowledge, there hasn't really been much of a statement from the White House press corps. the only sort of condemnation or discussion about this I've seen are from pretty pro-Trump Republicans, Congress, pardon me, Republican congressmen and women, and a couple of senators. But a lot of the Republican leadership in the Senate and the House seem surprisingly quiet about this, and it's like it's just astounding to me that this massive escalate. Again, I can't overstate this. This is an escalation that has resulted in Russia firing ICBMs at cities. Granted, not with nuclear warheads, but this is something that is throughout the Cold War. This has never happened before. An ICBM has never been fired in anger at a target, and this is where we are. And it just astounds me that Western governments are either completely silent or lackadaisical about this development, or they are outright encouraging it and saying, well, not encouraging the Russians to fire the ICBMs, but encouraging the Ukrainians to carry on conducting the sort of attacks with the weapons provided by Western powers that are resulting in the Russians taking these kind of actions. Because again, just to sort of outline the position to people so they understand what it is, there is no real, even from Western governments and from the Russians themselves, there is no real pushback to if the Ukrainians build and develop their own drones and their own missiles and fire them at targets in Russia, that's just kind of, I think there's a sort of understanding on both sides that this is, well, we're firing our missiles into Ukraine. If the Ukrainians build and fire their missiles into Russia, yeah, obviously not good for us, but that's just kind of how wars work. But whenever it is Western-made systems being supplied to the Ukrainians, and it is almost certain that it is NATO and Western satellites are identifying targets and, in the best case scenario, are very subtly saying to the Ukrainians, look, we can't tell you what you want to hit and what targets you should fire at, but, if you look at these coordinates, there might be something there that you might want to take a very good look at, kind of thing.
Yeah, but don't you think these weapon systems, American and UK, they're being prepped and set up by the Western powers? Because the Ukrainians can't put in the targeting and all that sort of thing.
I'm skeptical of that. I'm sure that there have been Western advisors, quote unquote, who have gone into Ukraine, but I think the crews and the targeting itself, I think that NATO provides potential coordinates and stuff and says, look, there might be a very interesting thing for you guys to look at this position. But in terms of actually putting in the targeting data, I mean, the ATACMS systems that have been sent to Ukraine are pretty old. This is stuff, the specific missiles that Ukrainians are currently using were used by the Americans in the first Gulf War. They're not the highest tech, ultra modern systems. Like countries like Morocco and the Greeks operate.
What are people like, example, Scott Ritter and all that, who say that these weapon systems couldn't be used without US or UK personnel?
Well, I have personal issues with Scott Ritter's narrative, and I would say to that, the Moroccans, for example, and the Greeks, they operate this system. Granted, they're not exactly firing him, but I don't think the Moroccans or the Greeks would have bought their own ATACMS with the idea that they had to get approval from the Americans if they were ever to use them, kind of thing.
What about the Storm Shadows?
The Storm Shadows, I'm not too sure about. A bit more of a modern system, but from my understanding, they're kind of mid-2000s. I've not worked around missiles. I've not put in coordinates and targeting data into missiles. So, again, this is just my sort of armchair estimation of it. But I'm sure there's probably been a fair amount of training that's been given by the French and the British and the Americans on how to fire and deploy these weapons. But do I think that there is a British, a French, or an American military personnel in Ukraine at the control seat firing these things? I'm very skeptical about it going that far.
Okay. Sweden is preparing its citizens for potential nuclear scenarios, so is Russia, and here as well they've just released where the nearest bunker is for people. Is there an overreaction, or should other nations be taking similar precautions?
I think it's a bit depressing that we are recreating the Cold War. I was born after the Cold War, so I grew up with my father was a soldier stationed in West Germany, so he told me all the various stories about what he experienced there, the 5-minute alarm and all this kind of stuff. So I do find it very depressing that we're kind of sliding back into this era, but I do also think it's probably a bit prudent of Sweden, and I do think other Western. I think in general it should be just kind of even if we weren't in this situation where we are at the moment, I do think that there is a case to be made that there should just kind of be a general peacetime training or exercises and awareness made to people, be it military conflict, be it some kind of natural disaster, be it like, say, for example, if there's a disruption in the oil supply. I do think that there should be this kind of culture, or maybe not culture, but
awareness
exercises, or this kind of idea that from time to time the population should be aware that, you know, this life that you are living of relative abundance, of carefree-ish existence, where it's just consumer society and it's just about earning money and living your life, that is actually quite unique in human history, and the world is a very dangerous place, be it from human action, be it from natural disaster or whatever. So I would approve of it, but I do find it a bit depressing that it's only coming back in because we have gotten ourselves into this terrible state of effectively recreating the Cold War with Russia. So could probably have answered that a bit better.
Yeah, but look at Belarus here, right? As you know, Lukashenko's never threatened anybody, never invaded anybody, but there's constant pressure on him and all around the borders. And as you know, which we'll discuss later, Belarusian state television has reported an alleged plan, to obviously do stuff here again. A couple colour revolutions, assassination attempt, and he's never threatened anybody, he's never invaded anybody, he's helped with peace, obviously, with Ukraine, blah, 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 blah. And it's just constant threats from the West.
Yeah, well, I mean, especially in Western countries with the demographics that we've kind of flooded our societies with, you would imagine that if we were preparing for any kind of disaster or catastrophe that's going to happen, it should be about terrorism. You know, the amount of terrorist attacks that happen across Western Europe, be it from knife attacks or roaming, meandering attacks such as like what happened in Paris at the Bataclan or something like that, you would imagine, well, that's probably the more realistic thing for people to train for. But even then, there's no real public consciousness or government action to train for that. It's just kind of, well, if it happens, it happens, and this is the society we live in, and isn't diversity a great strength? But, you know, it's those evil Russians that are about to destroy your way of life kind of thing.
Okay. With figures like Orban calling for a ceasefire and peace talks, what could be the most viable path towards de-escalation at this point?
Donald Trump assuming office, I think that's the best chance. I think we're probably going to see a massive escalation over the winter. As I've previously mentioned, it appears that Joe Biden is going to try and turn up the heat as much as possible while he can. I expect that the Russians are going to, and they have been over the past couple of weeks, trying to speed up their advance in the Donbass and their ejection of the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. So I think at least until January 20th, I think we're kind of locked into where the war is probably going to reach its highest intensity and its most fever pitch phase since probably the opening stages of the invasion itself. But once Trump gets into office, I think that's whenever we'll start to see de-escalation. I think the best way to... what Trump seems to be hinted at is a carrot and stick approach to both sides of the conflict, saying to the Russians, now is the time to start to slow down the advance, consolidate what you've got. If you continue the offensive action and pushing on beyond what you've got at the moment, we'll flood Ukraine with weapons, saying to the Ukrainians, you need to give up these just unachievable ambitions of yours to retake Crimea and the Donbass. That's just not on the cards. We're not going to fund you forever. Now's the time to sit down and bring up some realistic negotiation. Let me just get my bearings. Now's the time to formulate some realistic negotiation. What is wrong with me today? Now is the time to formulate some realistic negotiating positions going forward. Ultimately, I think what Trump is probably likely to try and achieve once he gets into office is some form of tepid ceasefire, as long as, while there'll probably still be skirmishes and artillery duels, is just to stop the advances on both sides and to sort of freeze the conflict in the meantime before they start to sit down for a proper negotiated settlement. In terms of actual tangible steps that could be taken, again, like I say, I don't think there is really anything that can be done until Trump gets into office, but I would say a very good it would go down very badly in Kiev and in certain European capitals. But what I think Trump could do is, once he gets into office, is he very publicly rescinds the authorization for Ukraine to fire ATACMS into quote-unquote internationally recognized Russia. I think that would send a very strong message to Moscow that, okay, now we have someone in Washington who is willing to dial back on what has on the state of the conflict as it stands. And then if Moscow reciprocates that in some form, then there might be another, then Trump could potentially look at, okay, what else could we do on our end to also, do we decide to tell the Ukrainians not fire ATACMS at all? Or you can't use this weapon system outside of these areas. Say, like, say Ukrainians can't fire HIMARS anymore into, say, like Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, but they continue to fire, but you can still fire it into Zaporizhia. Or you could only use it in a purely defensive capacity. So, say, for example, if the Russians are attacking in this area, you can fire HIMARS there, but you're not going to be firing HIMARS at stuff around Donetsk city anymore. Those are the kind of things to me that would, like I say, it would go down very badly in Kiev. But the problem is if you're trying to dial down the conflict, is you kind of have to start taking these systems and these capabilities off the table and see if there is a reciprocation from Moscow and from the Russian end, which could then dial it down again. So that could be maybe one aspect that the Americans under Donald Trump could go down to. Then it all depends on how the Western, the European countries would they play along with this idea. That's one roadmap where I could see, it just over months, potentially a year, various initiatives like that are put into place where it eventually gets to the stage where there is a kind of a de facto ceasefire announced, or it could just be this kind of all at once. The Americans, Donald Trump says stuff into Zelensky like, we've got a ceasefire proposal we're going to put to Moscow. We're putting it forward to Moscow whether you like it or not. If you disagree with it, we're cutting you off. Or, on the Russian side, it's like, look, we've got a ceasefire proposal. We've put it towards Kiev. This is what it is. If you don't, the Ukrainians are saying they're going to play ball by it. If you don't play by ball with it, we're just going to flood Ukraine with new weapon systems, kind of thing. They could be that kind of approach. I'm very interested, and to see how it will go forward. Maybe Viktor Orban, as you mentioned, could be the interlocutor between Trump and Putin. But at the same time, Trump, that's kind of one thing I've always liked about Trump, and it seemed to achieve a fair amount in international politics in his first term, is this very personalized politics of Donald Trump, where instead of these sort of roundabout ways, especially since the war began, where Joe Biden would send out like a veiled communique to Erdogan, who would then pass it on to Moscow, or this sort of like roundabout way where they'll never talk directly to each other. It always goes through interlocutors. Donald Trump very much seems to be the kind of man who won't do that, and maybe he'll just go directly to Putin, and he'll go directly to Zelensky, speak to them one-on-one, or maybe he'll even try and get them into a room together to sit down and try and hash out something together. Whether that's realistic or feasible, who knows? But I have a lot of high hopes for Trump to sort of put into path some, if not a complete, peace agreement, a ceasefire in some form or another, a freezing of the conflict. Maybe it will be a replication of the Korean scenario in Eastern Europe, which obviously isn't the best place we want to be, but I'm kind of at the stage now where the war needs to end. Far too many people have been killed, and with the recent developments this week, we really need to start dialing down this conflict before someone somewhere does something catastrophically wrong, and we all pay the price for it.
Yeah, if this conflict escalates further, what are the potential long-term geopolitical consequences for the NATO countries and Russia?
I mean, how much more could it escalate? The only escalation I could really see beyond this is a nuclear or conventional conflict between Russia and NATO, which would end in the same position. I mean, long-term potential consequences of that, nuclear winter, doesn't really seem appealing.
Have you read the book? Have you read this book, Nuclear War, by Annie Jacobson?
I can't say I'm familiar with it now.
Yeah, you should read it. It's quite interesting. It starts off with North Korea. It doesn't say why, but it just says it sends one nuke to ICBM to America, and then within 72 minutes, everybody's firing nukes. Everything.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's the.
It just escalates just rapidly, because the Americans are going to fire nukes at North Korea over Russia. Russia sees all the nukes and then they just launch everything as well. So it just off it goes in 72 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, it's disturbing that we're even discussing. Like I say, this is stuff from before my time. This is what my father and parents grew up with. So the idea that we've decided to replicate this again, it's like, guys, we dodged the bullet on human extinction the first time. Do you really want to replay the odds a second time?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Australia. Our city was a target because the B-52s used to land there from Guam.
Yeah, it's insane. It really is. And I mean, I think the geopolitical consequences are already locked in. We have erected a new sort of cold, don't want to say burning wall, a new iron curtain, as it were, except for it's moved a lot more east. Russia's in a more disadvantageous position than the USSR was, but that has made it potentially a bit more unpredictable and maybe a bit more desperate. But at the same time, it's picked up a very strong, powerful new ally in China, which completely changes the dynamic. So there was always this kind of quasi post-Cold War demarcation between the West and the non-Western powers, potentially oppositional powers. The United States, particularly towards the late 1990s, whenever they kind of needed a new geopolitical rival after Yugoslavia and the collapse of communism, well, they kind of just picked up China, as it were, mostly as an economic threat, but now increasingly as China's began to exert itself on the international stage as a military threat. So whenever you've built up China to be a geopolitical rival, well, what is China going to do? It's going to ally with the other geopolitical rival of the United States in the West, which is now Russia. So you've managed to unite the world's largest landmass with untold resources and the world's largest nuclear power with the world's most populous nation and rapidly growing economy. And then alongside that, you attach North Korea, you attach Iran, you attach all these other states that on their own wouldn't be internationally, heavyweights. They aren't internationally, they aren't international great powers. They are regional powers, but is the threat from Iran spoken of in South America as much as the threat as, like, say, the Chinese or the Russians, economically, militarily, or politically? Not really, but now that you've sort of put Iran into this block with China and Russia and North Korea and potentially Nicaragua on all these other states that have these axes to grind or feel aggrieved by the post-Cold War American-led world order, well, you've just kind of built up this. You're building up the Second Cold War. It'll be hard to see how we get away from this. I hope we do. I think it's all a tragedy. I do view Russia as a European nation. I do think Russia is part of Europe. It is part of this common civilization. I do feel that Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians are of the same sort of like civilization as me. I do think Europe stretches from Ireland in the west all the way to Vladivostok in the east. So I do find it a tragedy that we've kind of pushed Russia away, and I very much am using that term intentionally, as in they have been pushed away rather than sort of welcomed in. That's not to say that I don't want Russia to have become like this westernized liberal democratic world order sort of state. I think in an ideal world, I would like to have seen Russia be part of Europe and part of the world order, but as a credible example of an alternative to what we have in the West, this sort of over-globalized, the nation state is largely irrelevant for international corporations and for faceless bureaucrats across national borders to just enact these sort of globalist policies. But obviously the West could not tolerate such an idea, so we've now gotten to the stage where they've effectively pushed Russia. And it should be said, while there's been a lot of pushing on the West part, is that there's certainly been certain actions that the Russians have done over the years that probably haven't helped their case. Certain things could have been handled better. There were certain things that Moscow probably shouldn't have done to. So I do think there's been a bit of push and pull on both sides. But I do think that the events specifically in Ukraine have largely have their origin in the US State Department and in Brussels. And I do think Russia has mostly been a reactive power rather than the proactive force in the conflict in Ukraine in its origin. But how exactly we rectify this, how exactly we move beyond this and get to a sort of pre-2014 state of affairs, if that's even possible, I'm not too sure. To be honest, I think most Western governments are sort of viewing Russia, their long-term game plan for Russia is a repeat of the USSR, in that they are effectively banking on and hoping for some form of state collapse. How credible that is, I mean, it's happened to quote-unquote Russia and the USSR twice in the last century. Could it happen a third time? I'm not too sure. Do we actually even want that to happen? Do we, like I said before, we dodged a bullet in the Cold War with nuclear Armageddon. We dodged a second bullet with nuclear proliferation from the collapse of the USSR and all these nuclear weapons across post-Soviet states. Do we really want to play that, roll the dice again, that say if Russia does suffer some form of state collapse in the future, what happens to its nuclear arsenal? Does it end up with very unstable and dangerous people? We would prefer it doesn't. It just astounds me that this is the sort of logic that Western powers seem to be approaching, if there is even a logic there at all. Like I say, Western governments, the British government, the American government, seems to be extraordinarily lackadaisical about the recent escalation that they have unleashed upon Ukraine. And while this discussion is mostly about the international ramifications of it, it should be said that because of what Washington and Joe Biden has permitted for Kiev to conduct, it does appear that normal everyday Ukrainians and Russians are the ones who are going to be suffering the brunt of this. It is people in Dnipro who were struck by this ICBM attack today. It is potentially people in Belgorod who have been under shelling and missile attack for pretty much 3 years continuously. And people in Kursk Oblast and Bryansk who are going to be in the flight path of these ATACMS and Scout missiles that are going to be fired across their skies and their cities as well. So while we're talking about the sort of grand politics and the military aspect of it, I do think people often sort of become rather detached from the idea that alongside the soldiers who are dying at the front line is that a lot of innocent people who are just going about their normal daily business are bystanders and caught in the middle of this conflict waged between these two great powers.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a human face to.
Oh, here's a bonus question for you. Yesterday, George Galloway on his show and a few others have said that we are now, since these missiles started into Russia, we are now in a conventional World War III. What do you think?
A bit hyperbolic, but I can see the logic behind it. Thankfully, I think Moscow is. I think the viewpoint in Russia at the moment is this is going to be painful for us. We'll respond in kind with the ICBMs, but ultimately we're just going to eat the loss. We're going to overcome it as we have before in Donbass. ATACMS isn't the end of the world. We've been dealing with it for a while now. We'll overcome it. We'll mitigate it because we now, say if Joe Biden got re-elected, or in some form, or Kamala Harris got elected, well, then there isn't a time limit for the Russians to work by. It's just, okay, well, now they're firing ATACMS into us, and this is the way it's going to be, and things are just going to get worse from here on out. Whereas now it's, okay, we might just have to eat 2 months of this stuff until Donald Trump gets into the office, and now someone we can work with. So I think the logic for the Russians is, to a degree, a element of restraint. We're going to make a demonstration. We will retaliate, but we're not going to go above and beyond, as it were, because there is a time limit on this stuff, and it ends on January 20th, 2025. So I do think time, to a degree, is on the Russian side. So this idea that we are now in direct military confrontation with Russia, we aren't, and we haven't been. We've been close to it, and there certainly seems to be parts of the British and Western governments that are very keen, disturbingly, to provoke that kind of thing. But thankfully,
Well, Russia is sure, and like I said, even not Scott Ritter, but other people like Ray and all these other places that, from the CIA and all that, have just said all these weapon systems cannot be used without Western help at all. They need the targeting from NATO satellites, well, US satellites. They need someone to put the coordinates in. They need to do all that sort of thing, because all that's secret stuff. You need the secret clearances to handle all that information, and essentially the Ukrainians are just pressing the button. And even Russia believes that.
Yeah, but what I mean is...
So essentially that is direct involvement, isn't it?
Hold on, I'm a bit lost at the moment. So do you mean it as in direct involvement, as in the Russians are going to start... Well, I mean, whether that is or not, are the Russians going to start firing missiles into the UK or into Germany or into the Baltics or Poland or at the United States? They aren't.
You don't think they'll, if this keeps going, they'll target some places in Poland or that sort of places, or Romania where these command centers are?
No, I don't think the Russians would ever do that. Unless the Ukrainian military is about to arrive on Red Square. I don't think the Russians would ever do that, because that is...
So you don't think they'll call NATO's bluff? Article 5?
No.
Okay.
I don't think Moscow is eager to do that, and I don't think most of NATO is eager to do that as well.
Mm-hmm.
They'll dance around it, but I don't think there'll ever be that scenario will come about. And if it does come about, that's the kind of moment where it's get your canned goods and go to the woods kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's only one way that ends, and it's not good for human civilization, to put it bluntly. And I mean, it is just so self-evident of where that would go, which is why both sides have, to a large degree, avoided it as much as they can.
Yeah, but if that's self-evident, why do NATO and the US keep escalating this, going up the ladder constantly?
Because Moscow hasn't been able to properly retaliate, because Moscow has an arm tied behind its back, because the only way Moscow and Russia can respond to these escalations is hit Ukraine harder. Well, how do you hit Ukraine harder? Well, aside from the ICBMs, you just launch larger drone or missile strikes, because if you decide to respond by bombing something inside Poland intentionally, well, then you're in direct military confrontation with NATO. And that's not something that Russia could really handle at the moment while it's encumbered in Ukraine. So the only end point there is some form of nuclear conflagration.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I want to ask you about Belarus, just as the last thing. I know I didn't ask you this before, but on Belarusian state television, it was reported that an alleged plan by opposition forces and Western allies to launch an attack on 4 territories in the country's southwest. The operation is said to involve armed groups from Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine. The report claims that the plan outlines an initial assault by nationalist militias on Belarus, which would then be supported by mercenaries and NATO forces. Additionally, it alleges the Polish intelligence services are actively involved in training the militants to carry out the attack. It is noted that according to the plan, Belarus should first be attacked by nationalist groups, then mercenaries from Poland, Lithuania and Ukraine, and NATO forces will be brought in. And as I said, the Polish special services are helping prepare this military attack. Now, this was on TV yesterday, all over Belarus, and on the 3 channels. Your thoughts on this?
I'd be a bit skeptical. There is definitely Belarusian nationalists who are being trained by Western powers, but for the reasons I just outlined in the previous question, an attack on Belarus would be tantamount to an attack on Russia, as it's viewed in Moscow. Could there be some case where like a bunch of Belarusian nationalists decide to cross the border from Ukraine in some kind of provocation? Yes. I'd be very, very surprised and very, very disturbed if they came across the border from Poland or from Lithuania. I do know that there's been like some kind of occasional shots fired from the Polish side and the Belarusian side on the border. But in terms of like an armed group actually crossing the Polish border and trying to hold territory, that to me would be extremely disturbing, and also very unlikely that the Poles would allow that, because the Russians, especially alongside the Belarusians, would consider that an attack tantamount as if it was being occurred on like an armed group crossed the border from Estonia into Russia itself. And then you get into your direct confrontation with NATO kind of scenario. I am sure that there is constant planning in plots, particularly by the Poles. I don't know why the Poles are particularly have this issue with Belarus. Maybe it's just because they view Belarus as like an extension of Russia on their border. But I'm sure there are constant attempts and plannings for color revolutions to topple Lukashenko. that's just kind of the nature of the game, is that if the Western powers dislike a government, is that they will attempt to oust them by whatever means is necessary. Thankfully, it does appear that Belarus is the kind of society, and Lukashenko has erected the kind of state that can see off these pretty blatant attempts. But if it got to the stage where like NATO troops crossed the border into Belarus, again, I just come back to the previous answer, where that's the kind of situation where it's get into the woods and away from populated centers as quick as you can, because that just starts a spiral which ends up in pretty much only one outcome.
Okay. Any final thoughts?
Final thoughts would be the next couple of months are probably going to be some of the worst of the war, very likely. I think both sides understand that there is this metaphorical clock starting to count down until January 20th. So we're probably going to see the highest intensity fighting and dying since the opening stages of the direct war in 2022. But on a somewhat lighter note, I do think that the end is in sight, thankfully, for all the nations involved. 2025, at the latest, hopefully 2026, unless they assassinate Donald Trump. Hopefully there will be some form of peace will return to Eastern Europe and Ukraine and Russia. And then instead of talking about the stopping of the killing, maybe we could start talking about some form of reconciling of these fraternal nations with each other.
Okay, thanks for coming on. Once again, where can people get hold of you?
Yeah, I'm Bukhanka Watch on Telegram. If you just put it in, it should come up with my channel. Michael Delabrock on X/Twitter. And it's always a pleasure. Sorry if it was a little bit worded. I'm just a bit scattered.
No, that's fine.
Today, so apologies for that.
That's cool.
And
big thanks for coming on.
Not a problem. Always happy to. And thanks for having me, and have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye. And that's the end of live show number 98. Thanks for tuning in. We appreciate it. If you could hit that thumbs up, it would be great. Also, please share the video near and wide and on your social media to help this channel grow. And if you haven't, please subscribe. Hope you liked tonight's show. Thanks again, and see you next time. Bye.
I see that it's wrong! It's wrong because it's like against society!